so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
We got Martha and Alana and Mitch. Great. Okay. Fantastic. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. We'll let a few other people roll in. I have never been completely decided. I think the like the speaker view is good on when it's this format, but I don't know.
I think the speaker view probably will work the best for you. It should flip to the person that's talking.
Yep.
I mean, that's a podcast hack right there. I like the gallery view because then I can see who's going to come in, because we use Zoom for our podcast.
Oh,
if I can see who's about to speak, then we kind of cut down on the sorry.
You don't do an audience thing. You just do the participants at the time, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
We thought about doing, I think we've done the live thing once, because we've done like live shows in pubs and at venues and conferences and things like that. And then when lockdown started, we did one online, and it was fine, but when people aren't in a room drinking, it didn't feel like so much fun.
Yeah.
I miss doing live shows like hard. I did one for 50th episode, 100th episode, and I mean, the energy is so cool. Like if you can really work the room and you can really get people into it, there's nothing like it. It combines the best of both worlds, live and virtual, for sure.
Shawn, your show is about food, right? But I seem to have a weird L&D slant as well, where it was was that just because you know a lot of L&D people that you got
Ask
involved?
These two, I'm not sure where they are in your window. Weird is probably the best way to start any sentence involving me.
Right.
I'm here for it. Like I got a shirt that matches my tattoo. So like,
oh, that is weird.
That is pretty. It's consistent.
Yeah,
it is. But
what is your tattoo? What am I looking? Is it a skeleton with a
long
hat
story
on?
short, because of the podcast, if you've ever read Tony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential, I became friends with his executive sous chef Beth Aretsky. She one night on a napkin in a bar drew this logo. He adopted it as his. And so this is what you see when you see Bourdain. My claim to fame now is that she and her daughter come and hang out for weekends here at the house. And I'm the only person she's actually given permission to get it tattooed. A lot of people in the food industry will get it. I'm it, baby. I'm it. I'm there.
All right.
Sorry.
Oh no!
I started hosting. Sorry, you carry on.
Yeah. No.
Okay, so
now we've got episode of the Nerdy Shop Talk podcast has been brought to you by.
We've got aliens. We've got tattoos. That part we may or may keep into the video as we progress. But Julie,
what
maybe
you was going to happen, Tracy.
So you're going to go ahead and get
Julie. Let's go
started. So anyway, welcome to Nerdy Shop Talk. So like lots of people, I think that Tracy and I found that some of our most interesting learning experiences happen when we're just kind of chatting with colleagues. Whether it's at conferences, which we're not obviously doing a lot of right now, where you get to have drinks with people and see them in person, but hopefully we will again soon. Or even just Zoom calls or other conversations. And we thought that that's kind of an interesting possibility to let people eavesdrop a little bit on some of the Nerdy Shop Talk conversations that we have with our colleagues. And that might be an interesting thing to let people into and encourage them to comment or ask questions too. So if you have any questions, we absolutely encourage you to comment or questions in the chat. We do leave the participants muted just because otherwise it gets really complicated to manage it all. But welcome to Nerdy Shop Talk. And the topic that we're talking about today is podcasting, because it's such a fascinating learning medium. But I think when we start to translate it into what we do in learning and development, there's some interesting kind of quirks associated with that. Our guests today are Jay Sharpe, who is, let me check my notes, the Learning Content and Delivery Manager for Philip Morris International, who's been writing some really interesting stuff and doing some interesting experiments with podcasts within the organization. We have Ross Garner from Emerald Works, who is the host of the Good Practice podcast, which is my personal favorite industry podcast. It is, and not just because the accents
Very
are
kind
awesome.
of you to say.
Yeah. Not just because you guys sound really, because I love a good Scottish accent, but also because I think you guys do a fantastic job with that. And we have Shawn Rosler, who we've known for a long time, who's a longtime learning and development wonk, who also runs a podcast about food. So we're getting the outside podcast, the Course Grind podcast, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So Tracy's going to lead us off with an icebreaker question. I don't know if it's an icebreaker.
I'm going to introduce Julie first, too, just in case you don't know who Julie is.
Oh, that's right. We so, do that part.
Julie is an instructional designer and author of Design for How People Learn, one of the best-selling instructional design books. If you haven't received yours yet, please get it in the gift shop when you leave. She's a respected international speaker and instructor and has been recognized as a guild master at the e-learning guild.
Yeah.
Or now the Learning Guild.
And then continuing with introductions, Tracy Parrish. She's just one of my favorite get things done people. She does instructional design, project management, development. She's a frequent speaker. She's an articulate community hero and a moderator of Learn Chat on Twitter on Thursday nights, which you should totally check out sometime. And she creates a really amazing list of free resources at her website. The link will be in the show notes. So free resources for things like e-learning development and so forth.
So a quick little question. Can you just give us one little something that you are very nerdy about that isn't e-learning or learning related? And not
I think we already know
Jay's.
We were talking about it
we've already talked about this in our so mine is Aliens, the Alien movie franchise, and anything about that. I can get pretty nerdy with that.
Yes, which is fantastic. Love that. How about you, Ross? What's something else you're nerdy about?
Yeah, so I like the Alien franchise as well, but that feels like it's I want to go Star Wars. I am a deep Star Wars guy. I think it's my video's on. You can see the Stormtrooper behind me.
Yeah.
Nice.
Little cameo there.
Yeah.
Scout Trooper, sorry for the purists.
Excellent. All right, Shawn. And we may have already covered yours too, but
well, so the obvious is cooking. I'm going to step away from that and play to the room. Ross and Jay, if you look behind me, there's 3 sonic screwdrivers and a TARDIS up on top. Doctor Who for me is like the standard. And Capaldi, go Scots, best ever, hands down. So
I bet we were all really popular in high school.
Yeah, real popular.
Yeah. If I wasn't typing during this chat, I'd probably be crocheting or knitting. So it's right there at the ready to go.
All right. So just to get started on the podcast thing, I think a lot of people are kind of under the impression that doing a good podcast just involves sitting down with a decent quality microphone and recording things. But I've had a couple people who've told me that they want to do podcasts like This American Life, something like that. That doesn't involve an enormous amount of production support and things like that. So what, besides having a good quality microphone and kind of sitting down, is involved in doing a good podcast? What are the other things you think about when you're doing it? Ross,
I'll get my nonsense answer out of the way because my 2 colleagues are going to have better answers than mine by far. I get asked that a lot because, it's kind of the thing people do. COVID happens, everyone becomes a maker of some kind, and a lot of people became intellectual makers. And so people went to podcasts. Well, what do I need? What kind of technology do I need? I might have the unpopular opinion here, but here goes nothing. A microphone, computer, and a concept. The most important of which is that last one, the concept. You can't have a muddled idea. And, I'm at this now 7 years, 159 episodes. And my concept is still evolving, but what it was at its core is really what it still is today. So when you get that concept, for me, that's more important than any technology, any software, anything like that. You don't have to spend a dime legitimately to make a podcast. You do have to spend intellectual capital to sit, hind end in chair and contemplate, what is it I want to say to people? When I think that 159 episodes of this food knowledge is going to be there long after I'm gone, that's kind of a cool thing for me to soak in. Who's listening to it? No more than they are today. But just in case someone finds it, it's nice to know that it's there as a relic of my existence. So that concept for me is key. Concept, really nothing else.
Yeah, I was laughing because I would have said exactly the same thing. Like, it is easy to start a podcast. Anyone can record themselves and put it on iTunes. That process is actually really, really simple. But it took us like a year to work out what our concept was. And we were doing episodes the whole time. So I think that the thing that you really need is a passion for something. And it helps if you're really passionate about podcasting, because we were doing 50 terrible episodes in that first year without a structure and no format, and no one was listening, which looking back was advantageous. But if we weren't passionate about doing podcasts, we never would have had the stamina to get through that point and eventually get to where we are now, which is ripping off other podcasts that we like. That's how we kind of worked out what our format was going to be, what worked elsewhere, and we're going to use that. In particular, the Slate Political Gabfest. If you listen to that, that's the exact same format as our show. And I was laughing at Julie when you mentioned This American Life, because we decided that we were going to try 4 This American Lifestyle episodes, and we abandoned it because it was so much work. And we've now looked back and decided we're going to try 1 episode for, sorry, Shawn, I know it's not a competition, but our 250th episode, which is coming up, is going to be a This American Lifestyle thing, but it's definitely a lot more work than just us sitting around and chatting about a topic.
Yeah, I agree with actually a lot of what both the chaps have said. I think for me, I mean, microphones are good and good quality headphones are good, but you don't need them. I mean, I've got a couple of us have got kind of the half decent way mic, but that's probably because we're just a bit techie and geeky and like to spend money on it. You really don't need it. I think for me, from a learning perspective, I think it's like any kind of learning vehicle, right? I think you need to be clear on what your objective is, what you want to do with your episodes, you know, or whatever you want to do with your series. And then I guess the thing I would say that makes the biggest difference for me is just that learning. And you start off bad, I know I have been, but just learning how to manage and build rapport with your guests, because it's a real skill learning when, you know, when you let the conversation go on, when you need to kind of bring it back in, that takes practice. And great hosts make it look really, really easy, and then it's deceptive because then you try and you fail miserably, but then you get good at it. But I think that's definitely a thing that separates it for me. That's when I know, and that's been a pretty good one, because I was able to really kind of go with the flow of that conversation.
So leading from that, then what makes it a good learning experience rather than just something that you want to listen to? There's some that we just listen to when we're, you know, as we said, doing the laundry, but there's others that we really focus because we want to listen and learn from the hosts and the guests. What makes them different?
I'm not sure an individual podcast is a great learning experience. So I'm going to take the contrary stance, I think. And the reason I say that is because of what you said there about folding the laundry. It's very unusual to sit and just listen to something that you're not doing anything else. So you're normally, if you're driving, you're part distracted, or you're walking the dog or whatever, things like that. When it gets into like the workplace, it's even harder, because if you're sat at a desk, have you got emails pinging and alerts coming up and stuff like that, I don't think it works that well as a learning experience at all. What I would say is a long-running podcast series overcomes that hurdle, because you might listen to our show and find it interesting and fun, but then not remember anything about it, you know, a week later. But if you listen to it every week, you start to pick up the recurring trends that keep coming up. And there's certain ways that we would talk about things around learning and development that we just keep coming back to because they're just good ideas. Pardon me. I would say the same thing about something like Freakonomics is a show that I really like, where I don't really remember any of the topics that they cover, but I think I've developed a reasonable understanding of behavioral economics, because they talk about the same concepts basically every week, and it's just different ways of applying them. So I'm not sure one episode on its own is that great as a learning experience, unless you're returning to it as a reference material. But listening over the long term and building a relationship with those hosts and those guests, I think that can work.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, which is not actually something that you see all that much in, you know, kind of L&D stuff. We tend to be, we've got to cover this thoroughly and have it be a kind of complete experience in and of itself, as opposed to kind of an ongoing thing. And one of the things we were talking about before we got started was practice development. And I think there's something really important about being able to get exposure to case examples over time. And so that's kind of super interesting based on what you just said. So.
Yeah,
hey,
I was going to say.
Go
Oh, go on, Shawn. You go for it.
No,
you
go
go
ahead,
first, my
go ahead,
friend. I was just going to say, I agree with what a lot of Ross said. I think they can be good experiences, but actually, to Ross's point, I think so. One of the examples that comes to mind that happened years ago was I had done a podcast episode with kind of an enterprise team that was responsible for building biz for large enterprise clients. And they'd done this bid, and kind of word had gone around that it was really successful. And there was a lot of good learning in there. So obviously some long process. So we chose a podcast to do with him. And again, I was a little bit skeptical, thinking, is this going to be useful learning? I mean, yes, there's an objective. Yes, there'll be some stories and some best practice, and that's good. So I think it worked somewhat, but I think where it was more effective was so many teams and people came to us afterwards saying, every single time I'm about to start a bid process, I listen to that podcast. So it became more of a, less of an experience and more of a kind of what Ross said, performance support, almost a resource, because that was the thing they were going to do before they sat down to do it. I'll listen to that podcast because it got them straight back in to that best practice. So I think often, and I think I do that myself, I'll save certain episodes and certain things where I found something particularly interesting, and then I'll listen to it again and again at relevant points in my life when it's relevant to what I'm doing. So I think they can be extremely useful when you think of them like a resource almost.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Before I answer, awesome comment from Taruna, I guess, and I'm sorry if I butchered that. That's on me. Don't blame anyone else here. I like to listen to podcasts where the underlying philosophy is driven by passion and or curiosity. If learning happens, that's great, but sometimes it's about listening, looking for ideas that one day might end up becoming something more. For me, yes, my center lane for the Course Grind podcast is like culinary stories. Tell me the narrative behind the heart and soul, behind the past, behind the door in the kitchen. That's what I really try to do. But behind that, I've interviewed everyone from a vintner to an oyster farmer to a Michelin star chef and everybody in between. So there's not necessarily this really narrow center lane, but it is there. And it's the philosophy and it's the love of, I'm going to cook for you to show you I love you. And when we step back, and my last question that I ask, and Ross, you have a format. I stole a format from Melanie Denea from My Last Supper. 50 famous chefs, same 5 questions. And, it's about their last supper. And my last question is always, what is food to you in a single word? And so many of them say love. And just like that, for me, that philosophy is what drives it. Looking to it as a learning exercise, I agree with you, Ross. Like, you've got to have an archive for it to be such. Whereas in any learning and development, we expect in the moment, get everything they need in and get them out the door. With a podcast, you got to get them, you got to hook them, and then they can go back and then they can view episode 43, episode 89, whatever. With that said, I work for a group, Office Practicum. They gave me the green light to say their name. And within 3 months of joining them as a senior ID, they're a pediatrics electronic health record. I pitched the idea for a podcast to clients to basically introduce leaders on the front. And they loved it. And we're turning episode 22. We're going bi-weekly now. And to the point, the listenership was low at first, but when a backlog was created, it went up, and the backlog went up as well because people learned about it. It went out in marketing emails and so on. Did they necessarily learn something skill-wise? Probably not. But did they know something about someone, and maybe, the next time something was amiss or something was off, maybe they weren't so quick to be like, that's an invisible person to me. I don't know who they are. No, I don't. I do know who they are. I listened to 15 minutes and I learned what their mission is with this path. So
yeah, it's super interesting. So what's the one that you're doing, Shawn? What's the subject? Like, what are they learning from that podcast, basically?
So basically what we're doing is going across the organization, identifying leaders from different areas. Maybe it's accounting, maybe it's finance, maybe it's marketing, maybe it's the knowledge team, and just asking them, who are you? Where'd you come from? What do you do? Why is it important to you? Why is it important to OP and our clients?
That's super interesting. Wow. I love that.
And it's quick. It's this bite. And then there were some major changes to charting in pediatrics. And our internal medical expert, Dr. Cressley, I had on like 3 episodes over the course of 5 episodes. So like out of 5, she was 3 of them. And you saw the need, because now they were looking to learn something. You saw Spike, wabam, wabam, every time she was on. So they knew when to go back to learn, but they could also just listen and get to know.
Yeah, that made me think of a really, really good point as well. They're, again, on their own, it's one thing and the effectiveness can be deemed, but as part of a solution, I think that's where they could be quite powerful. So we recently developed, pretty standard leadership development program, usual what you'd expect, virtual training, of course, in the way the world is right now. And there was, let's say there was 8 sessions in total. What we did was a podcast episode based on the subject of each one of those sessions with a senior leader from around the business, where we could give participants a time. They attended the course, then they left, and a few days later, when they're starting to reflect and kind of work things out for themselves, then drop the podcast episode with, we're kind of exploring the subject a little bit further, getting real life examples. And we found that worked really, really well, because it gave them another kind of avenue to explore the subject on their own time without having to pull them back into a live session or something like that. And I think that worked really well for that program.
Nice.
Do you mind if I come in there? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I'm curious how that worked in practice. And not to start hosting your show, sorry guys.
No. But this is it's a Nerdy Shop Talk conversation. You're allowed to ask questions.
Yeah. Okay, great. Because we got a new CEO last June time, and one of the things he wanted to do was start an internal podcast. Because there was a lot of changes going on. We're Emerald Works now. We used to be Good Practice and Mind Tools. If people have heard of Mind Tools, we're them as well. It's a bit confusing. There's lots of organizations smooshed together. So what John wanted to do was do an internal podcast where he would speak to people from around the business on a weekly basis. And he ended up doing like 33 shows, something like that, which was really, really good learning for him, because he got to speak to lots of people and find out what different people did. It gave an opportunity to people around the business to have 30 minutes with the CEO and have a chat around what their concerns were and so on. A little difficult to get people to listen to it though, because you had to have an @emerald.com email address in order to listen. And one of the beauties of podcasts is, once they're on the web, free distribution all over the world, really easy to find. And when you put in a mechanism like we did, it made it that the hurdle was that much more to listen, and then also it affected the analytics as well. We couldn't really always tell, depending on how people were listening, what even those numbers were. So I'm wondering, Jay, was your podcast open or was it shut down, and how did you work?
No, so it's a good question. So I mean, even though I've been really literally messing with podcasts for years, I've never done anything external outside of an organization. They've always been kind of internal series or internal episodes. So there's kind of pros and cons to that. I mean, it's obviously you have good reach, because if you leverage your internal comms channels or whatever intranets you've got, then that's great, because potentially you can reach an audience and kind of give your content a longer life. But then obviously it's more difficult, because there's not really a functionality for people to subscribe. There's not really an ongoing notification system, so it becomes more tricky. But I think in some ways it's, at least we are talking to the audience that absolutely is right for us. So depending on whatever internal comms the business is using, usually there's kind of an audience split or a functional split, so you can target things to certain groups. You could obviously share, and then again, if you're using a decent LMS or an LXP, and you can engage with content and comment and share. There's a lot of good features like that as well. So potentially some benefits, I guess, over doing it externally. But yeah, I've only ever really delivered them inside the firewall of an organization.
And was the firewall important, in the sense that you didn't want anyone outside of the organization to listen?
Well, for me personally, I'd make everything available. I think I would.
Classic L&D person.
Exactly. Yeah. Why not? Transparent. Let everyone see everything. But I understand why, there might be, for example, if we were a bit like I mentioned that podcast earlier, where we were talking through a bidding process, some of that might be sense that the business might not want to share all their kind of best practices for that. So I get it. So I don't think it massively hurts, but I would, it'd be lovely to just make them open. But of course, you're dealing with organizations, big international businesses that will probably be not too keen on putting something out there that they don't control the message, for example.
Well, so this is segues really well into a question I have, is that when we have learning, it tends to be, we have to teach them topic A, B, C. And when you have a webcast or podcast, the topics, the discussion takes you in places you don't expect it to take you to. There's guests asking questions of other guests, and you don't know what's going to happen, right? Like you said, the rapport, bringing people back into what your main focus is. So how do you balance that where a really great robust conversation is going versus keeping on the topics that you were initially supposed to go with? Do you branch it to another episode? Do you try to pull people back? Do you let it just flow as naturally as you want?
Yeah. For me, for the course grind, for work, for OP, it's rigid. It's 15 minutes. It's in, out, over. Right. Mm-hmm. But for me, I've always wanted this from day one, it to feel organic and authentic. Those two words for me. I don't care what the clock says. I don't care like where we go. I want to kind of stick to the script, but I typically don't. And I've had more folks, I've had folks from Chop, Top Chef, all these shows come on the show and we'll hang up and I'll hear them like sigh and I'm like, oh God, they hated it. And I'm like ready to hang up. They're like, that was the coolest interview I've ever had. And I'm like, all right, you're lying or you're drunk. I'm not sure which. And they're not. They go with it and they're like, it truly felt authentic. And I've had guests cry. I've cried because we get to play when we think about food memories. And, a lot of people would think like food memories, whatever, that's stupid. But if you hold it true, if it's your thing, man, you really clutch onto that. So for me, authentic and just real and organic, because, and to that point, 159 episodes, I've had a handful of return guests who are busy. There's a new show on True TV, Fast Foodies. Chef Justin Sutherland is on that, where they recreate fast food items. And it's awesome. It's crazy, right? But he's been on the show now 3 times. And like he's Hollywood now. He doesn't need me. And yet, because we have that rapport, because that genuine connection happened. Like people see that, and if they want to tell their story, they're going to see through the fake, and they're going to know when real is real. And so for me, it's I don't worry about a clock. I don't necessarily worry about a structure. If it's a live show or like I'm in doing a cooking demo or something, like we actually have a user conference this Friday and Saturday, and I'm doing a cooking demo Saturday morning, kind of half in the podcast, half in Office Practicum, but I'm going to be doing a brown butter omelet, talking about the science behind browning butter and blah, blah, blah. So their structure, but for the most part, down with you, we're going to go where it takes us, and that's it.
So it sort of depends. It sounds like, that's part of that conversation around concept and stuff. So like Ross, you usually, I think, try to keep it to time, right? Like that's.
Yeah, we're really conscious that our topic's not fun like Shawn's. So he's talking about food and memory and emotion, and we're talking about XAPI and compliance. So we're very aware that our audience could.
You can't make anyone cry talking about that.
You can.
Maybe actually,
over XAPI.
So yeah, we try and aim for 30 minutes. So normally 30 minutes of kind of like the serious chat, and then the 5 minutes at the end. And I will like wrap it up. I do watch the clock. So a couple of reasons. One is because I think people consider it part of their job to listen to our podcast a bit, because it's like a work podcast. It's about industry. Yeah. And then the other thing is kind of to Runa's point in the chat from earlier on, that she wants to listen to podcasts that have passion, and if learning happens, that's great. But sometimes it's just about listening. I always say that the podcast should kind of be entertainment first, and then if you get something from it, then that's useful, because you want people coming back every week and having a relationship with the hosts. And so if it's a really good chat, and I end it at 35 minutes, I think that's quite a nice way of having people come back the next week to get some more, rather than they feel that I've outstayed my welcome, which I know I can do.
Yeah.
So
to that point too, we brought it up before about how being a host, after a while you begin to get some skills to you. While I do embrace organic, there have been some guests of questionable quality, as I like to call them, GQQs, where I've had to wrap it up. I've had to hit fast forward, but I don't want to clown them. I don't want to make them look bad. So I do push them through their answers. I do nudge them in that direction. There has been a couple of times where an intoxicated guest needed a little help getting to the end of the episode. But that's just when you get into the food industry, that's what happens. So, you know, you do. So I don't necessarily watch time per se, but again, you know, I can see where Ross is coming from. If I was in that framework, I would absolutely want to hit that mark like I do with the work podcast.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
So Jay, I was just going to go to you. What was your experience?
There's a great comment in the chat, and it's exactly what I was going to talk to you about at different times and things. I'm a bit like Ross. I'm a bit of a diligent planner and organizer, so I do watch the clock and I do put together, you know, a very rough flow. I mean, maybe it's the learning designer on me, but I'll have a very clear objective and I'll try and stay true to that. But where I think I've got better and developed is that learning when, do you know what, this is so good and so meaningful. We're just going to go with it. So I've done that several ways. We've done pretty short podcasts. I've done long podcasts, and we've gone 60 minutes. I've done longer than that, actually. And I do remember one time where we were doing one podcast. It was supposed to be a kind of 30-minute overview of a certain area. But right at the beginning, there's such a personal story from someone about why this was important to them. And it was just fascinating because it gave you a real insight into this person, why this subject was compelling and why it meant something to them and why they were doing all this work around it. So that's why by that time, I think I'd got confident enough to say, do you know what, I'm just going to let this go and it's going to be worth it. And I hope, you know, your listeners or your audience trust you to kind of respect their time. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I think sometimes shorter is good. I think sometimes longer might be good. And that's the beauty of the podcast format. You could really lean into it. You know, they could go on as long as they like. And if it's relevant and compelling, there'll probably be an audience for it.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, we're so bad as a society at letting people lean into their stories. We're such a hurry up society. I just had actually one of my guests from like the late 50s, Steve Atherton from Monomar Vineyards. My wife took me to California on a driving trip up the coast for my 40th vineyards, and we went to Monomar, met Steve. He was on the show. Great guy, great mission and everything. 2 years later, I see on Monomar's page, Steve had passed away. And his wife messaged me and said, "Thank you so much for doing that episode. We listened to it today and really appreciate it."
Oh, that's so
like,
nice. Yeah.
When we think about the permanence of this, whether it be professional or personal, like there's gravity here, kids. It's heavy. It's going to be here long after we're gone. And so, you know, the content and the passion, you know, the persona and the structure, to Taruna's point again, you know, there's a balance between the two for sure.
Well, and then the next question I had on the list is kind of what's special about the podcast meeting, but I think you've already been talking about it, right? But there's something about that kind of like listening in your ear that has a certain intimacy to it. So like one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking about like the talk to lots of people in the organization was, oh, you know, this is a super interesting one for new hire orientation. Because I was working on a new hire orientations always make me a little crazy because they don't ever have like concrete behavioral objectives besides setting up your email accounts or whatever. But you know, I once was working with a really great client on that, and I was like, well, if really, what's the goal? What do you want the people to do? And they're like, I want them to go home and tell their friend or partner or whoever how excited they are about working for the company. That's what I want. I want them to be able to do it, and I want them to be able to like, you know, when they're meeting with friends, to be able to have a 5-minute reason why they're super excited that they came to work for us, you know, and that's what I want them to get out of new hire orientation. And I'm like, that's beautiful, right? And I can see like podcasts and stories and hearing from different people through the organization and maybe spreading it out over time being a really nice way to communicate some of that stuff around values and purpose and, you know, the individual experience of different people and things like that. So interesting, but yeah.
That's how we're using the podcast I spoke about earlier, the one that our CEO did, John. So yes, it was a great experience for him to do it. Now we have 35 episodes in the can, so that now sits on our intranet site as you know, for new hires. It's you can pick a department and you can hear, folk from that department talking about their jobs and talking to John about it. So we've turned it into that resource, but It wasn't designed like that. It was only afterwards that the thought came that this could be used for this purpose.
Right. Well, and to your point where you were saying the issue is like that it was a great experience for him to do it and totally worthwhile, but like the issue of getting people to listen. So what about the logistics of it? What about the devices and access? And then the other big one for me is podcasts are my way to fill dead time, for lack of a better term. You know, like I'm going to walk the dog, or literally folding the laundry, or, you know, like driving someplace or whatever. I love them. I think they're great for that. But like, I'm not going to be like, I'm just going to go sit on the couch and listen to this podcast. You know, it's always the time, the space comes first else. And I fill it in with the podcast rather than I'm going to carve out a specific opportunity to listen to this podcast. So how does that play into work environments where people don't necessarily have tons of dead time?
Well, I mean, I think that's okay as well. I think that's the great thing about podcasts. We all probably have really different habits for when we listen to them. You know, I do listen to them when I'm at work, when I'm emailing or project managing and doing that kind of work. I find it relaxing. I listen to a lot when I'm playing games, but only like just before Christmas, I got a message on a Saturday from a colleague going, I'm sat in my garden with a beer, listening to your podcast on this subject. It's amazing. And my first thought was, what's he doing on a Saturday listening to this podcast about a work-related subject? But then I thought, you know, who am I to judge where this guy should spend his time? And if that's how he wants to relax and unwind and take in some information, power to him. So I think that's, again, it's a kind of a beauty of the podcast format. But in terms of in an organization, they could be used so many different ways. And I've seen occasions where, you know, teams have got together to listen to it live and then kind of debate it and debrief it and pick it apart afterwards, which was beautiful to see. And it happened completely organically without anyone kind of poking them or telling them to do that. That just happened. And I think that kind of just spontaneous learning is brilliant.
Yeah, that is a good approach. To your point, Jay, a couple former guests will text me and be like, hey, I'm listening to you while I'm doing prep for dinner tonight for dinner shift in the restaurant. And that to me, like, I mean, my heart just like jumps out of my chest. I'm like, you're listening to a show about cooking while you're cooking. And yet, what do? I have Food Network or Bravo on in the background. I'm not adding that. Otherwise, I'm losing a finger or two, but I'm listening. So there it is. So, you know, we want to do that on. I love that idea, Jay, about getting people together as like a team building exercise. Take 15 minutes out of a team meeting, listen to a podcast that's topical and go nuts. Like, you know, because that's that, you know, getting everybody in a room, spilling mental guts and cleaning it off to find out what's left in the middle. And there's your truth. So that's a great idea.
Do you think normal people do that though, or is that an exception? And
I was just gonna say, it's so funny we're so opinionated about it because the five of us are in it. Like, our opinions shouldn't matter. It should be everybody else on this right now going, here's what we think, here's your truth. We're kind of skewed, but I
people that listen to podcasts listen to a lot of podcasts, I typically find, and people that don't are just not interested and don't know what you're talking about.
Well, that does sort of suggest to me that the idea of like required podcasts as part of a learning experience is probably a tough thing, right?
Yeah. It's a forced hand.
Yeah, if you were going to make it part of, say, I don't know, like a formal certification or assessment, then probably not too fair, because again, I think providing it as an optional extra or as an added value or as a deeper dive or as a, hey, you love this, so you want to go more, then I think it works really nicely. But yeah, to make it too formal, again, it's like everything. If you make it too formal, you'll ruin the fun.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of that. Like if you make it require it too, then you're forced to listen to whoever that person is that's speaking. And sometimes there's like, I'll listen to an audio book and I'm like, I cannot listen to this because I can't listen to that person read it to me. So being forced that way, I like the idea of a deeper dive, a supplemental learning to something.
Okay, so usually we leave participants muted, but I actually think, Tracy, we should turn Taruna on so she can tell us about this podcast.
Yeah, she made a great comment in the chat.
Yeah, I'm totally curious about this. Taruna, are you willing to talk about it?
Hello, everyone.
Hi there.
Taruna,
Hi.
welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. This is so my jam. So I'm nerdy about podcasts. Well, what I wanted to share here was like this informal learning experience that I go through every month. And I'm a part of a podcast brunch club, which is a worldwide club. I'm a part of the Vancouver chapter here in Canada. And every month there's a playlist that's released, and each of the chapter owners actually produces the playlist and shares it with the worldwide audience. And we listen to that playlist and then get into a discussion. So what I found really interesting is that the podcasts in the playlist sometimes are topical. For example, International Women's Month, or things to the effect of Black Lives Matter, and sometimes they're just things that we like to talk about, just fun stuff, suspense thrillers. And because of those playlists, I get to experience podcasts that I would not be naturally drawn towards, and eventually end up liking some, and even picking up some new ideas and cross-pollinating that into my job as a learning professional. And it happens so organically that I almost cannot say what was the source of that idea.
Yeah.
But I know that it's coming from all those, episodes of listening and then talking to other people about the podcasts. But it's a fun thing
Such
to
a great
do.
example.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting because I'd never heard of podcast listening clubs, but it of
If
course
you,
makes sense.
if you have a link to that, maybe you could share it in our,
That'd be
our
awesome.
chat. For
I will
Yeah,
share it with
that'd
you
be great.
here. And
Perfect.
along with that, I will also talk about just one more minute about an app. It's called Podyssey app. And it's kind of like, podcast recommendation app. You can also listen to podcast on that. But every time you listen, you get an option to share and recommend it to others and put your two little bits on what you liked about each of the podcasts. So all of the podcasts that you guys do feature on my profile because I listen to all of you. And I tend to recommend that to other people on Podyssey. I don't think we have too many learning professionals there. A lot of nerds for suspense thrillers, I must say.
That sounds
But that's
so
another
cool,
way.
though. Yeah.
Yeah, another way to just get others interested in things that learning professionals are talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm going to drop those links in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Super.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Taruna.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And well, we didn't really have a question about Clubhouse, but it's an interesting thing because I haven't decided if I want somebody to let me know if there's a point where I should care about Clubhouse because
You should care.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
should care.
All right. Okay. I'll take your word for it then. Because there's certain things where, that kind of follow the Google Wave model, right? Like, everybody was kind of clamoring for invites and then there was nobody,
Can't get rid of them. Do you want one?
Well,
I've got 18 ready.
Yeah, I've got some.
Sure.
I've got some.
Yeah, why not?
The
Okay.
discussion I was in last week about it being a giant social experiment was, is it just a means for whoever they are, to just grab the tones and inflections that we use when we have conversations so that they can build their AI better and better. So it's nothing more than just a giant data collection.
Wow.
Oh, you take that further. Like, how many people on Clubhouse are actually an AI? And
that was the other question. Yeah, who here is actually a real person and not a computer?
Is it just a test environment for their new voice software?
Yeah, it was a little frightening when they started saying that. And then somebody went on to a whole tangent about Area 51 and scientists and all this stuff. So yeah. So let's pull it back here. So what are some of your what are some of the biggest podcast fails you've had? We love learning and development and instructional designers. Like, we are the people that learn from our mistakes, and we like showcasing our mistakes because we are learning from them. So what's something you can share that others can learn from?
My first 50 episodes. Just scroll to the bottom of the feed and you'll find them all. They're still there.
Well, so what did you, what was the big lesson then from shifting from those 50 into the sort of more mature podcast that you did?
So we decided to do a weekly podcast. So we recorded one and then we published it. Mistake one. Because in 7 days we needed another podcast. So we didn't have any other ideas. We only had one. didn't practice first, didn't do any like pilot episodes, just recorded the first chat and thought, job's a good one.
Don't we all do that?
That's fine. So doing some practice. We never did do practice episodes, we just kept publishing them, but I think you get better over time. And we also, I mean, this is going to go back to like letting the conversation run on or not, but we decided we wanted to do 30-minute episodes, but we would record for an hour. And then it would take like 6 hours to cut it down, or 8 hours to cut it down. So now we're like, this is why I'm really harsh when we chat now. I'm like, we're at 35 minutes, we're wrapping this up because I'm not editing this for another 8 hours. Nice. So very, very strict. I think those would be kind of my 3 takeaways.
Okay. Yeah, no, that was actually one of my questions, was about the editing piece. Because I mean, honestly, the decision to do this as a video cast was partially because we knew we were going to have multiple guests. And I think there's something nice about being able to see who's talking. But the other thing was, we're not really going to edit a video cast. So that kind of takes that piece off the board. We trim front and back, and that's about it. Right, Tracy? So, yep.
I like that.
I've got a couple. I was thinking about this just while Ross was going. So the biggest, the most silly one, I guess you can imagine, is I forgot to press record. So yeah, that happened.
Yeah, we've done that. Yeah.
That's why episode 4 isn't posted for us.
Yeah, it happens, and it happened twice, and then I've never done it since. But that's a pretty big one. Which was a long time ago, but then relatively recently, I guess, since I used to do quite a lot live, but then of course lockdown and stuff, they've all been virtual now. So we're leveraging, tools like Zoom and Teams and everything else to record them virtually. And I think the biggest kind of mistake I made was a lot of guests wanted to keep the cameras on. So I did a few episodes with the cameras on, but then what I found was when I was listening back to it as audio only, there was a lot of dead time because, of course, all the acknowledgement is happening visually. So there's a lot of nods and hand movements, but there wasn't the verbal, like, oh, yes, I understand. And I found that, so that taught me, okay, I need to turn the videos off when we just do a podcast, because that will force us into that kind of audio acknowledgement. But so that was a silly little mistake I made and have learned from.
Well, no, that's
we do
super
the
interesting.
opposite, though.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, we leave cameras on because we think that it helps with rapport, and because there's normally 3 of us in our show, we can see who's going to come in next. But I think something that maybe we've got better at is doing those audio cues ourselves. In the very This American lifestyle. Oh, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have to remind myself to do those as well, even when somebody's thinking about a question. Ours is straight audio, no video. Always has been, likely always will be. And entering more than typical, like, tell me more about just to kind of fill that space, because even 2 seconds sounds like a pretty hellacious lag when you're in it.
But then I guess we edit it though, so maybe that's the difference, is we cut down those
I
don't touch it. I'm too lazy.
I don't like editing because I'm dead lazy on that, so I try and avoid editing anything.
Here's a big sound file. Poof, podcast. It's really that easy. I too have forgotten to hit record. One thing that I did learn the hard way was I had a webcam and my snowball mic plugged in, and it defaulted to the webcam mic. And so it sounded like I was 10 miles away. And so I'm playing it back. I'm like, where the hell's the audio track? What's going on? And then I realized it. So 2 episodes really kind of hit the skids. Like, posted it. We were able to amplify enough that it was audible, but no one's listening to that. Probably my biggest lesson learned, though, in doing this again, because it's more passion project than profession, is that celebrity does not always equal quality. Some pretty massive letdowns. I'm not going to name names, but there was a celebrity chef who was an absolute difficulty to deal with. He said, you got 20 minutes. And literally, I watched the clock at 19:59. Mid-question, he hangs up.
I've had that as well, actually. Yeah, they weren't
really.
They weren't even famous. They just were busy, I guess. I was kind of like, why did you agree to this?
It's crazy, because like now this is why I love the up and comer story. I love even like people from Top Chef. Yeah, they're on Top Chef, but like they're still really trying to get their go. I have so many cool connections because of it. Now, like I'm at the point where hot sauce, the one guest I had, I have a box of hot sauces that have been sent to me. I've done a spin-off of the show, Course Grind Podcast Tries It. And it's a video cast on YouTube where like maybe me and my son try hot sauces, cheeses, whatever they're sending us. So we've kind of gone the video route, but like, give me that connection any day over oh, well, I'm selling cookware on QVC. I really don't care. I'm sorry. I don't, it's just me.
In contrast to what I just said about respecting the time and, like not.
I was just going to say, Ross, yeah.
I'm going to have to leave.
Yes.
Oh, Ross has to go, everyone.
Yeah. Click.
What a brilliant segue. Yeah.
It's very rude and I apologize, but I appreciate the invite.
No,
and, it was nice to
Thank you, Ross.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, nice meeting you, Ross.
Yeah,
Thank
you, Ross.
you. So maybe we'll get to the wrapping up area here. So what's maybe your favorite podcast you've done then, Shawn? You've kind of mentioned one that kind of failed. So do you have a favorite? Can you label one?
I could name my favorite kid easier, I'll be honest. And it really depends on the day.
Yeah.
God almighty. I'm literally gonna need a second with that. Toss it over to Jay because I can't, right?
How about you, Jay? Is there a favorite podcast you've done, or a favorite, not the favorite? But...
I've got a few. The one I mentioned earlier about the kind of really personal story, that was great. You had a really cool one recently where we were developing this leadership program, and this person's name kept coming up over and over again in terms of developing it. It used to be with the business and was really respected and a great manager. And I just he'd retired, and I reached out to him and said, "Hey, we're doing this thing. Everyone talks about you and these behaviors that you used to talk about. Do you want to just talk for 60 minutes and have a chat about it?" And to my surprise, he completely loved the idea and was like, "Yeah, I'm retired. I need something to do. Let's do this." But he was so, just really impressed that the company still remembered him and that people still value him, some of his ideas. And that was a really fun one because he gets really insightful guy and lovely kind of discussion. But yeah, that was a really good one. I really enjoyed that one.
Oh, fantastic.
I'm gonna have to give you a slight array. I can't land on one, okay, but I'll give you a small handful. Stephen Reichlin from Project Smoke, if you watch like WVIA, public television, he's been a guest lecturer at Harvard on the history of barbecue and everything like that. He agreed out of nowhere to be on my show and then followed it up by being on my wife's 40th birthday video. Like I texted him, I'm like, "Hey, would you do a quick?" He like sends it right back and sends me like a picture of him in my podcast shirt. I'm like, even serious right now? There you go. Stephen Reichlin.
That's so
rocking
cool.
the colors. Okay, this is funny because second one was Oprah's former chef, Art Smith. He was amazing. Like he was everything you thought he would be on air. So I mean, celebrity wise, there's that. I interviewed my mom and I interviewed Greta, and those were two like really super like near to my heart experiences, just because of what they are. And then I have to name my first episode was with the chef Testin from Top Chef, Dakota Weiss. I mean, relatively unknown at that point. Fast forward, she was on episode 131. And that was one of the first times I on air because I was reading her intro and I got about halfway through it and I had to stop and I went to edit it and I'm like, nah, I'm going to leave that in there. Like that's worth it. And it was the coolest talk because I turned on TV like a week later and there she was with Stone Cold Steve Austin and Steve-O cooking them something on TV. And I'm like,
there you go.
She made it. Like that really made me feel like a weird kind of tangential proud dad. So bunch of favorites. I could probably go on, but time's short.
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap up here in a moment. But and actually, I'd love to know from everybody in the audience if you can put it in the chat. What's your favorite like podcast to listen to? You know, we've talked about a few, but what's your one of your favorite podcasts to listen to? It doesn't have to be learning related or anything like that. Any podcast.
One of my favorites, and I still haven't found anything that quite has sparked me wanting to listen to the next episode as much as Death in Ice Valley. It's a cold case file from the maybe the 60s, maybe the 50s, and just it was a BBC one, and just the way that they brought in the sound, it made you feel like you were in the middle of the forest listening to the rain. Like you could feel the rain on you as you're listening to it in the middle of the podcast and them talking about where they were and stuff. So that one's really still a special one to me.
Nice. Jay, what about you?
Yeah, I listen to a lot because I'm a fan of the format. So I mean, based on my hobbies, I listen to them that match. I listen to a lot of video game related ones, aliens related ones. I love Dan Carlin's Hardcore Histories, which is amazing. Really kind of deep look at really cool moments in history. Really like those. Learning related, really like one called Game Professor. But I tend to listen to whatever's kind of relevant in my world at the moment. So if I'm working a lot in an agile project management style, I'll start to listen to a lot of podcasts about agile. So I kind of match things up to what I'm doing because I think that somehow helps me learn. So I do that a lot as well.
All right, Shawn, what about you?
Yeah, for me, it's really I'm the worst to answer this too, because I'm not going to come with something intelligent at all. Like I love listening to like stand-up comedians. The Opie radio podcast from the days of Opie and Anthony. Once he split off from that, he started having like Carl Ruiz, Nick Solares, who's done the show. And they literally just sat around and just bashed on each other. And for me, that became a background just while I was doing like PM work for our LLC or whatever. It just kind of went to the background. And yet, like, I found I had a couple slings and arrows next time I was out with friends. I'd be like, oh yeah. And, I'd get them with one. I'm like, hey, I remembered that from the podcast. I do, Serial was amazing. Remember a picture being taken at DevLearn of me, and her name eludes me, but I believe the caption was the most listened to podcast host and the least listened to podcast host all in one picture. And
nice.
Classic.
Yeah. My favorites are, I'm a big fan of the Brain Science podcast for industry stuff. I think Ginger Campbell is the Terry Gross of like brain science. I, for non-learning related stuff, I'm pretty in love with Dolly Parton's America, which is Jada Bumrad from Radiolab. And also, I think I mentioned it before we got started, but the Films to Be Buried With is a really nice one around the power of the format. Like the format's super consistent from episode to episode, but it really, like the questions are nice and kind of pulling super interesting stuff out of the listeners. So, all right. So it's shameless plug time, guys. What would you like to plug? What would you like to tell us about? Is there anything that we should take a look at from you? Or if there isn't, then, anything that you would like to direct people towards that you think would be useful for them. So
nothing much from me. If you want to occasionally see me write weird things about learning or aliens or video games, you can follow me on Twitter, which is at Geiger's Pet. I occasionally, when I have time, write some thoughts down on LinkedIn, so you could look at that stuff there, and feel free to connect, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, Jay's got a terrific one on podcasts that he did on LinkedIn that we'll put in the show notes as well. So, all right, awesome. Fantastic. Shawn?
Awesome. Yeah, Course Grind Podcast, COARSE, Tracy. Course as in...
Oh, sorry. Yes, I know that.
I wish it was for a guy named Shawn. Things get misspelled all the time, so don't worry about it. Course Grind Podcast, available on YouTube, iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcast. iHeartRadio now, I guess. My producer just told me we're out there, so I listen to him. I'll be like, here's an episode. Yeah, be sure to check it out. Click subscribe, whatever it is you do, and message the show. Like legitimately, if you have ideas and you have a place that you love that you don't think is featured or needs to be known about, like, I'm your guy. I love telling that story. So, reach out. Let me know.
All right. Fantastic. And thanks, Taruna and Catherine, for being for your super excellent chat additions. And yeah, Tracy, anything you're plugging before we wrap
we've
up?
got we've got the Canadian e-learning conference is coming up this June. It's virtual. Unfortunately we can't join together live. But virtual, and Twitter chats on tonight, or Learn Chatting means on tonight, 8:00. If you want to talk about learning there, we'll be on every Thursday. My dog is apparently trying to plug something right now. Sorry. Whining.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I don't think I have anything terribly crucial to plug right now, but I'm super delighted everybody was made it here today, and thank you guys so much. This has been really interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot of useful stuff about podcasting and some things that I hadn't really thought about. So thanks again for joining us.
Good time.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay.
Take care.